What if one small gesture could unravel a lifetime of hidden pain and rewrite your future in a single day? Imagine a quiet, unassuming woman, her heart weighed down by years of silent grief, stepping into a moment that changes everything. Meet Evelyn Harper, a 67-year-old widow in the quaint town of Willow Creek, who's faded into the background since her husband, Army Sergeant Robert Harper, passed away. Once the life of every community event, Evelyn now lives in the shadows, her once bright spirit dimmed by loss. But what if one selfless act could bring her past roaring back and transform her future forever? Stay tuned as Evelyn's story unfolds, revealing the power of quiet kindness, right here on Daily Narrated Stories, where we share heartwarming tales of real compassion every week. Evelyn's mornings start at 5 a.m., the sharp beep of her alarm cutting through the stillness of her modest home on Maple Lane. By 5:30, she's guiding her aging 1998 Toyota Corolla out of the driveway, heading to Carter's Dry Cleaning, where she's worked for 27 years. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," calls Joe, the night guard, as he finishes his shift. Evelyn gives a faint nod, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, a quiet sorrow etched into her expression. The shop, just a stone's throw from Fort Bradley, specializes in military uniforms, and for Evelyn, pressing them is a sacred duty. Each fold must be perfect, each button polished, each insignia precisely placed. Her coworkers often wonder why she takes these orders so personally. "Let me handle these," she whispers, her voice barely audible as she gently takes the uniforms from younger hands. These aren't just clothes, they carry a story. What her colleagues don't know is Evelyn's secret. After pressing each uniform, she tucks a handwritten note into the pocket. "Thank you for your service. You're enough." Her delicate handwriting carries a message of gratitude, a ritual she's performed thousands of times over the years, a quiet tribute to the soldiers who remind her of Robert. At home, Evelyn's life is a solitary rhythm. A lone dinner at her kitchen table, the clink of her spoon against the bowl echoing in the empty space. A cup of lavender tea as the evening news drones softly, and a nightly ritual that keeps Robert near. She opens the wooden case in her living room, gently wiping dust from Robert's folded flag and medals, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, honors from a life of service cut short. "Good night, Robert," she murmurs, her voice trembling with longing as she presses her fingers to her lips, then to the glass, her touch lingering as if she could feel his warmth through the cold surface. Now, picture yourself as Evelyn, standing at a crowded bus stop on a stormy day, your knees throbbing from arthritis. You've just claimed the last seat on the bus when a weary soldier boards, his uniform drenched, his face lined with exhaustion. Do you keep your seat, knowing your knees desperately need the rest after a long day? Or do you offer it to him, despite the pain, because you feel a deep duty to honor his service? Share your choice in the comments below. Type 1 to keep the seat, or 2 to offer it up, and let us know what you'd do. If you're touched by stories of quiet heroism, hit that like button and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories for more tales that warm the heart. Every Sunday, Evelyn Harper sits in the last pew of Willow Creek's First Presbyterian Church, slipping in as the service starts and leaving during the closing hymn to avoid small talk. To most, she's just the widow from the dry cleaners, her voice a rare murmur in the sanctuary, her story a quiet mystery. She's been like that since Robert passed. The older members whisper over coffee, their voices soft with pity. High school sweethearts, you know. Never had kids. He was her whole world. They don't see the private rituals that ground her days. How she still sets 2 places at her table on Thanksgiving, the soft clink of china echoing in her silent kitchen, or how she buys the tangy horseradish Robert loved, its sharp bite a painful reminder of shared dinners, though she can't stand its taste. On her nightstand, his aftershave bottle sits, the cap slightly loose, releasing faint traces of sandalwood into the air, a scent that wraps her in a ghostly embrace, keeping Robert's presence alive in the stillness of her bedroom. In Willow Creek, where American flags wave proudly on every porch and yellow ribbons adorn the ancient maples along Main Street, Evelyn moves through life like a whisper, her steps soft and measured. She spends Veterans Day at the town cemetery, kneeling beside soldiers' gravestones with a small brush and a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing away grime until the names shine again. She donates anonymously to the Veterans Relief Fund, slipping folded bills into envelopes she mails from the post office, her handwriting careful to hide her identity. Whenever the national anthem plays, at the Memorial Day parade or on the radio in the dry cleaning shop, she stands at rigid attention, her hand over her heart, her posture a silent salute. To those who notice, she's just another patriot in a town that wears its pride openly. But they don't see the depth of her devotion, the way each pressed uniform, each quiet donation, each moment of reverence is a thread tying her to Robert, a way to keep his memory alive in a world that has moved on without him. Evelyn Harper, loyal, unseen, kind, unaware that her life of quiet service is about to shift dramatically, sparked by one small act on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October. The sky had been a heavy slate all day, the air thick with the scent of rain. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the promise of a storm that would soak the town in minutes. At 5:30 p.m., as Evelyn clocked out from Carter's dry cleaning, the clouds finally burst, drenching her thin coat in moments. She pulled the fabric tighter, her arthritic knees aching with each hurried step toward the bus stop, the cold seeping into her bones like a cruel reminder of her fragility. Dr. Carter's recent warning echoed in her mind. "Evelyn, you're overdoing it. That arthritis isn't improving." She pushed the thought aside, her focus on getting home to her heating pad and a warm cup of tea, the promise of relief driving her forward. "Gonna be a soggy one, Mrs. Harper," called Mike, the driver of the number 15 bus, his voice kind as she climbed aboard, shaking raindrops from her gray hair, the droplets glistening like tiny jewels in the dim light. "Sure is," she replied, her tone soft but tired, the weight of the day settling into her frame like a heavy blanket. The bus was packed, the storm driving people from their usual walking routes, their damp coats and umbrellas filling the air with the scent of wet wool. Evelyn's heart sank as she scanned the aisle, spotting only one seat left near the back, a small oasis in the crowded space. Her knees pulsed with a deep, nagging pain as she shuffled forward, gripping the seat backs for support, her breath shallow with effort, each step a battle against her body's protests. "Thank heavens," she whispered to herself as she sank into the seat, a wave of relief washing over her like a warm tide. The cushion was worn, the fabric rough against her coat, but it felt like a small blessing after a 10-hour shift on her feet, her hands still tingling from the day's work. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tension in her shoulders melt, the hum of the bus engine a comforting backdrop, a steady rhythm that soothed her frayed nerves. Dr. Carter's words echoed again. "You can't keep pushing yourself like you're still in your 50s, but Evelyn had no choice. The dry cleaning shop was her lifeline, a connection to the military community that had been Robert's world, and now hers, a tether to the life they'd shared. The bus lurched forward, its wipers struggling against the downpour, the rhythmic swish-swish a soothing counterpoint to the patter of rain on the windows, a symphony of nature's fury. Evelyn gazed out, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. A childhood game that always brought a flicker of comfort on tough days, a fleeting reminder of simpler times. The streets of Willow Creek blurred into streaks of gray and blue, the familiar shapes of the town warped by the storm, as if the world itself were mourning with her. The gentle rocking of the bus and the steady sound of the wipers began to lull her into a doze, her eyelids growing heavy, her body craving rest. But at the town square stop, the doors hissed open, snapping her back to reality with a jolt. A tall man in a soaked army uniform stepped aboard, his movements slow and heavy, the weight of his burdens visible in every step. He leaned on a wooden cane, his left pant leg pinned up at the knee, water dripping from his cap onto a face carved with exhaustion, his eyes hollow with a pain that spoke of battles fought far beyond the battlefield. Evelyn watched as he scanned the crowded bus, his expression stoic, though his eyes held a deep, unspoken weariness, a silent plea for understanding. No one stirred. Teenagers stayed glued to their screens, their earbuds a shield from the world, their laughter a stark contrast to the soldiers' quiet struggle. A woman in a tailored blazer pretended to read her book, her eyes fixed on the same page, her fingers gripping the edges too tightly. An older man adjusted his hat, staring out the window with forced focus, his jaw clenched as if willing himself not to see. The air in the bus grew heavy with an unspoken tension, a collective avoidance that Evelyn felt like a stone in her chest, pressing down until she could hardly breathe. For a moment, she hesitated, her own pain demanding attention, a fierce ache that radiated from her knees up her thighs. The thought of standing for the rest of the ride made her stomach twist with dread, her body screaming for the relief of that worn seat. The heating pad waiting at home called to her, a promise of comfort after a grueling day pressing uniforms for an upcoming ceremony at Fort Bradley, each stitch and fold a labor of love. Evelyn's mind churned with conflicting emotions, a storm as fierce as the one outside, her heart and body at war. She could almost feel Robert's presence beside her, his steady hand on her arm, his voice a soft whisper in her ear. "You're stronger than you know, Evelyn." A memory flashed, Robert returning from his final deployment, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes shadowed with the weight of what he'd seen, his smile forced as he tried to shield her from his pain. She'd met him at the airport, her heart swelling with pride, but she'd noticed how people looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the sacrifice his uniform represented, their indifference a silent wound. The memory stung, a sharp pang of regret for all the times she'd wished the world would see what she saw in him. His courage, his kindness, his unyielding spirit. Now, on this bus, she saw that same dismissal in the passenger's indifference, and it sparked a fire in her chest, a fierce resolve to honor this soldier, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort, a small act to right a wrong she'd witnessed too many times. But then the soldier stumbled slightly as the bus rounded a corner, his cane slipping on the wet floor, a soft gasp escaping his lips as he caught himself. And in that moment, Evelyn's decision crystallized. She saw Robert in him. The same quiet dignity, the same unspoken burden, the same weary strength that had defined her husband. Her heart clenched, a mix of duty and longing surging through her, drowning out the protests of her body, a tidal wave of emotion that left no room for doubt. She pushed herself to her feet, her knees screaming in protest, a sharp pain shooting through her legs as she steadied herself, her voice stronger than she felt, cutting through the hum of the bus like a beacon. "Sir, please, take my seat." The soldier turned, his weary eyes meeting hers with a flicker of surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice him, his gaze softening with a gratitude he couldn't voice. "Ma'am, I'm fine. I can stand," he said, his voice gruff but courteous, a hint of pride in his tone. "I insist," Evelyn replied, her tone firm, though her hands trembled slightly, her resolve unshakable. "My stop's coming up." It was a lie. Her stop was still 30 minutes away, but it was the kind of lie Robert would have understood, a small deception born of kindness, a gesture to ease the soldier's burden. A young woman nearby, her earbuds dangling, muttered to her friend, "Why bother?" She didn't have to do that, her voice dripping with casual disdain. Her words stung, a sharp jab at Evelyn's resolve, but she barely heard them, her focus on the soldier now settling into her seat. Mike, the driver, caught her eye in the rearview mirror, shaking his head with a knowing smile that said, "Mrs. Harper, always too kind," his expression a mix of admiration and concern. But Evelyn didn't care. In her heart, those in uniform deserved respect above all else, a belief rooted deep in her soul. She remembered Robert's words, spoken over a quiet breakfast years ago, his voice steady with conviction as he held her hand across the table. When someone wears that uniform, Evelyn, they're signing a blank check to their country, up to their life. That's the highest honor. Those words had stayed with her, a guiding light through the darkness of his loss, a beacon that illuminated her path even now. They propelled her to stand, gripping the handrail as the bus splashed through puddles, her knees burning with each jolt, a fire that matched the determination in her heart. The bus ride felt endless, each bump and turn amplifying the tension in Evelyn's body, her fingers white-knuckled around the handrail, her breath shallow as she fought the pain. She stole glances at the soldier, who sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly around his cane, the lines on his face telling a story of battles fought and burdens carried. His uniform was faded, the fabric frayed at the edges, and Evelyn wondered about the stories it held, the battles he'd fought, the losses he'd endured, the moments that had shaped him into the man before her. A faint scar ran across his temple, barely visible in the dim light, and she couldn't help but imagine the moment that had marked him. Was it a battlefield injury, a shard of shrapnel in the heat of combat, or something more personal, a reminder of a life forever changed? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, adding a layer of mystery to the man now occupying her seat, a silent enigma in a sea of indifference. Around her, the other passengers seemed oblivious, their indifference a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing within her, a tempest of grief, duty, and hope. She felt a strange sense of isolation, as if she and the soldier were the only two people on the bus who understood the weight of that uniform, a shared understanding that bound them in that moment. When the soldier finally looked up and met her gaze, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity, Evelyn summoned a courage she rarely tapped in her quiet life, a bravery born of love and loss. Her voice, though soft, carried a warmth that surprised even her, a gentle strength that filled the space between them. "My husband was an army sergeant, Robert Harper," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue after years of silence, a confession she hadn't shared with anyone in decades. "Thank you for your service. We know what you give up." The soldier's eyes widened, and he studied her face with an intensity that made her heart skip, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Are you Evelyn from Carter's Dry Cleaning? The one who leaves notes in uniform pockets saying you're enough?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, a tremor of recognition in his tone. Evelyn's cheeks flushed, her secret ritual exposed after decades of anonymity, a private act of kindness laid bare. She nodded, sheepish, her fingers tightening around the handrail, her heart pounding with a mix of embarrassment and pride. "You don't remember me," he continued, his voice cracking with the weight of memory. "But I remember you. I'm Major Thomas Reed. 15 years ago, your husband, Sergeant Robert Harper, saved my life in Baghdad. I've been searching for you ever since." The bus fell silent, the hum of the engine the only sound as even the chatty young woman paused to listen, her earbuds forgotten in her lap. Evelyn's grip on the handrail tightened, her knees forgotten as the past flooded back, a tidal wave of memories she'd kept locked away, crashing over her with relentless force. Her heart raced, a storm of emotions swirling within her, grief, pride, longing, and a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. She could almost hear Robert's laughter, feel the warmth of his hand on hers, as if he were standing beside her on that bus, his presence a comforting shadow. A memory surged, waiting at the airport for Robert's return, her heart in her throat as she scanned the crowd, noticing his persistent cough, the way he'd brush off her concern with a smile, though his breathing grew more labored each year, a silent scar from the fire he'd never spoken of. She hadn't known then that his lungs were scarred from that day in Baghdad, a sacrifice he'd hidden to spare her pain, a burden he'd carried alone until it took him from her. Her throat tightened with a mix of pride and sorrow, the scent of rain mingling with the phantom trace of Robert's aftershave, a haunting reminder of the man she'd lost. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but fear held her back. What if this connection to Robert brought more grief than healing? A wound reopened after years of careful stitching? A humble woman, living a quiet life, yet carrying a heart so vast. And now, by chance, she meets her husband's comrade, a man whose life Robert had saved at the cost of his own. Major Reed's voice broke through her thoughts, his weathered face etched with gratitude, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Robert saved me," he said, his words heavy with memory, each syllable a testament to the bond they'd shared. "We were clearing a building after an ambush when it caught fire. I was trapped under debris, flames closing in, the heat so intense I could feel my skin blistering. Everyone was ordered to evacuate, the smoke so thick we couldn't see." Evelyn's breath hitched. She'd never heard this story, though she'd always known Robert kept the worst of his experiences from her, shielding her from the horrors he'd faced, his silence a final act of love. "But Robert refused to leave me," Reed continued, his voice cracking, a raw edge of emotion breaking through. "He ran back into that inferno, pulled me out, his hands burned as he dragged me to safety. He suffered second-degree burns and smoke inhalation, coughing so hard I thought he'd collapse. He never told you." Evelyn shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes, her vision blurring as the rain outside mirrored the storm within, a cascade of emotions she couldn't contain. Robert never spoke much about his service, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her grief. He'd just say, "That's what soldiers do. They don't leave their own behind," his voice so calm, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. A sad smile crossed Reed's face, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a shared memory of the man they'd both loved. "That sounds like him," he said softly, his tone heavy with nostalgia, always downplaying his heroism, as if running into a burning building was just another day. "But those injuries, Evelyn, they're why he was discharged early. The lung damage, it's what eventually," he trailed off, unable to finish, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them, a shared sorrow that needed no explanation. Evelyn's voice faltered, her throat tight with grief, a lump she couldn't swallow. "I know," she managed, her voice barely a whisper, the weight of those two words carrying years of unspoken pain. Reed nodded, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears, a silent understanding passing between them, a bond forged in loss. "I've carried that guilt every day since I learned the truth, that his sacrifice for me cost him his life years later, that the smoke he breathed for me stole the years he should have had with you." The air in the bus seemed to thicken, the weight of Reed's revelation pressing down on Evelyn, a heavy cloak of sorrow and gratitude. She glanced around, noticing the other passengers now watching them, their curiosity palpable, their eyes wide with intrigue. A man in a gray coat whispered to his companion, his expression unreadable, while a woman in a blue scarf leaned forward, straining to hear more, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal a military pin on her coat. Who else on this bus might know more than they let on? Evelyn wondered, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and unease, a sense that this moment was bigger than she'd realized. The rain pounded harder on the roof, a relentless drumbeat that amplified the tension, as if the storm itself were holding its breath for what would come next, a cosmic pause that mirrored the stillness in her heart. The bus slowed at Maple Lane, the familiar sight of her neighborhood coming into view through the rain-streaked windows, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the wet pavement. "Mrs. Harper, this is you," Mike called from the front, his voice cutting through the charged silence, a gentle reminder of the routine she'd always followed. But Evelyn stayed rooted, her hand still gripping the rail, unwilling to sever this fragile thread to Robert, a connection she hadn't felt in years. "I'll catch the next one, Mike," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within, a decision that broke her decades-long routine, a small act of defiance against the solitude that had defined her life. The rain continued to pour outside, turning Willow Creek's streets into blurred watercolors, the familiar shapes of her world distorted by the storm, a reflection of the chaos in her heart. In that moment, Evelyn felt a strange alignment, as if the universe had orchestrated this meeting on this rainy evening, a cosmic convergence she couldn't ignore, a sign that Robert was still with her, guiding her forward. Reed spoke again, his tone gentle but urgent, a quiet plea in his voice. "Mrs. Harper, I'm meeting some of Robert's old unit tonight. We gather every Veterans Day weekend. About 20 of us are in town, men whose lives Robert touched. We've been trying to find you for years, to thank you, to share the stories he'd want you to hear." Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, a drumbeat of fear and longing. She hadn't attended a social event since Robert's funeral. The thought of being surrounded by strangers, of being the center of attention, making her stomach churn with anxiety, a cold dread that threatened to pull her back into her shell. Her routine called to her, the heating pad for her knees, the quiet house, the predictable solitude that had become her sanctuary, a safe haven from the world's demands. "I don't know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darting to the floor. "I'm not one for gatherings these days, not since," her voice trailed off, the words too heavy to speak. An older woman nearby, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up, her voice warm but firm, a quiet strength in her tone that commanded attention. "Ma'am, if I may, sometimes opportunities come that we're meant to take," she said, her eyes locking with Evelyn's, a depth of understanding in her gaze. "I missed my chance to thank the soldier who saved my son in Afghanistan. I kept thinking there'd be time, that I'd find the words. There wasn't. Don't make my mistake." Evelyn looked at her, startled by her words, her eyes searching the woman's face for a clue to her story, a story that seemed to mirror her own. The woman's silver earrings glinted in the dim bus light, her expression unreadable, a faint tremor in her hand catching Evelyn's eye as she adjusted her scarf, revealing a small military pin, a subtle hint of her own connection to the world Evelyn knew so well. She nodded subtly, as if she knew more than she let on, leaving Evelyn wondering about her true identity. Who was this stranger, and why did she seem so invested in her decision? The question lingered, a thread of mystery that tugged at Evelyn's curiosity, urging her to step out of her comfort zone. The bus reached the end of the line, passengers disembarking with curious glances at the trio, still deep in conversation, their whispers trailing behind them like echoes. Reed's voice softened, his eyes pleading, a quiet desperation in his tone. "I understand if this is too much, Mrs. Harper. But Robert was our guardian angel. He watched over us all, kept us going when we thought we couldn't. We just want to tell his wife what he meant to us, to give you the piece of him we've carried all these years." Evelyn met Reed's gaze, seeing a flicker of Robert in his steadfast eyes, the same quiet determination, the same unyielding loyalty that had defined her husband. In that moment, she made a choice that would change everything, a leap of faith she hadn't taken in years. "All right," she said, straightening despite her exhaustion, her voice carrying a newfound resolve, a strength she hadn't felt since Robert's passing. "I'll come." They took a rideshare to a neighborhood Evelyn didn't recognize, the streets unfamiliar in the fading light of the storm, the houses casting long shadows on the wet pavement. As they pulled up to a modest house with cars lining the street, their headlights cutting through the dusk, her courage wavered, a flutter of nerves in her chest, a quiet fear of the unknown. "They'll be so happy to meet you," Reed said, helping her from the car, his hand steady on her arm, a reassuring anchor in the sea of her uncertainty. Inside, Evelyn stepped into a room of over 20 men in civilian clothes, many bearing visible scars of war, some physical, like the burns on their hands, others etched into their expressions, a haunted look in their eyes that spoke of battles fought and lost. The chatter died as she entered, a hush falling over the room, and one by one, they stood at attention, a spontaneous salute that brought fresh tears to her eyes, the weight of their respect overwhelming her, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to sweep her away. An older man stepped forward, his voice gruff but warm, his eyes glistening with memory. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Sergeant Major David Carter. Your husband saved my life. Took shrapnel for me in Fallujah, threw himself in front of me without a second thought," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Another approached, his hands trembling slightly, a faint scar running down his cheek. "He gave me his last water bottle during a 3-day patrol in 110-degree heat. The sun so brutal, I thought I'd collapse. He ended up in the med tent himself from heat stroke, but he never complained." One by one, they shared stories of Robert's quiet leadership, his humor in the darkest moments, how he'd crack a joke to lift their spirits during a 12-hour firefight, his small sacrifices that meant everything in war zones, like sharing his last piece of chocolate during a grueling march. A younger veteran spoke up, his voice thick with emotion, his hands clutching a worn piece of paper. "Ma'am, we know about your notes too. Those are enough notes you slip into uniforms. I kept mine through 4 tours. It's still in my wallet, a reminder of why I kept going." He pulled out a faded slip of paper, Evelyn's handwriting barely legible, the edges worn from years of being carried, a talisman against despair. A veteran named Mark, his voice rough with emotion, stepped forward, his eyes glistening, his hands shaking as he spoke. "I was on the brink of giving up after my 3rd tour," he said, his voice breaking, a raw edge of vulnerability in his tone. "Found your note in my pocket the day I planned to end it all, the day I thought I couldn't go on. You're enough," it said, in your elegant script. "I'm here today because of you, Mrs. Harper, because those words gave me a reason to keep fighting." His words hit Evelyn like a wave, the weight of her unseen impact crashing over her, a revelation that left her breathless. She hadn't known, had never imagined, that her small gestures could mean so much, that her quiet acts of kindness had reached so far. Another man, his leg in a brace, added, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I read your note before a mission in Kandahar, the night before a battle I didn't think I'd survive. It gave me the courage to keep going, even when I thought I couldn't, when the fear was so thick I could taste it. You saved me too, in your own way." Evelyn's breath caught, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility, the room blurring through her tears, a kaleidoscope of emotions she couldn't contain. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached into her purse, pulling out a worn letter, Robert's last to her, written days before he died, the paper soft and creased from years of being held. "I may not have done anything great," she read aloud, her voice breaking with each word, a fragile thread of sound in the silent room. "But I believe it's the small things, like your love for me each day, that truly make a difference in this life." The room fell silent, 2 decades of grief and love hanging in the air, shared among those who understood the cost of sacrifice, a collective breath held in reverence. Evelyn's voice quivered as she read, each word a dagger of memory, slicing through the walls she'd built around her heart, a fortress she'd thought impenetrable. She could almost feel Robert in the room, his presence a warm glow amidst the pain, his laughter echoing in her mind, a sound she'd longed to hear for so long. The veteran's stories had painted a picture of the man she'd loved, the man she'd lost, and for the first time in years, she felt a connection to him that wasn't steeped in sorrow, but in shared pride, a legacy of love that lived on through these men. As the evening ended, the air heavy with shared memories, Reed offered to drive Evelyn home, his presence a quiet comfort after the emotional storm. The rain had stopped, the streets glistening under streetlights, reflecting the glow of a town transformed by the storm, a mirror to the transformation within her. "There's something else you should know," Reed said as they drove, his tone carrying a hint of anticipation, a spark of something new on the horizon. "Our unit recommended Robert for the Silver Star and Purple Heart for saving me and 2 others that day in Baghdad. But due to lost paperwork, it was delayed, buried in bureaucracy for years." Evelyn frowned, confusion knitting her brow, her mind struggling to process his words. "But he received those medals. They're in my case, on display in my living room," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Reed shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Those were earlier commendations, for other acts of bravery. This was for the fire incident, the day he saved us. Yesterday, after 15 years, the final approval came through. The Secretary of Defense wants to present them to Robert's next of kin." Evelyn sat in stunned silence, her mind racing as she processed the news, a flood of emotions washing over her. Pride, disbelief, and a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. After all these years, Robert's final act would be honored, a recognition she'd never expected, a testament to the man he'd been. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, a mix of wonder and curiosity in her tone. Reed's smile widened, a glint of mystery in his eyes, a hint of something extraordinary to come. "That's the remarkable part," he said, his voice tinged with intrigue. "Your kindness on the bus wasn't seen by just anyone. That woman who spoke up, she's Senator Margaret Ellis, a former Army medic. She saw everything, heard our conversation, and called me right after, determined to make this right." Evelyn's eyes widened, her heart skipping a beat, a rush of adrenaline coursing through her. "The woman with the scarf? I thought she was a librarian," she exclaimed, her voice a mix of shock and amusement. Reed chuckled, the sound warm in the quiet car, a shared moment of lightness amidst the weight of the day. "She prefers anonymity when traveling, keeps a low profile. She's the one who pushed Robert's medal through after years of it being stalled. A final thank you for the man who saved her unit years ago." Reed's tone shifted, a hint of intrigue in his voice that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine, a spark of curiosity that kept her on edge. "Senator Ellis has a way of making things happen, Mrs. Harper, and she wasn't the only one watching." A man in a gray coat slipped a note into his pocket as he left the bus. "We still don't know who he was, or what he wrote." Evelyn's heart raced. What did he mean? Who else had been on that bus? Observing her quiet act of kindness, a silent witness to a moment that had changed everything. The question lingered, unanswered, a tantalizing thread of mystery that left her eager for the next revelation, a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. Reed pulled up to her modest home, his expression earnest, his eyes warm with gratitude. "Would it be okay if we came by tomorrow morning to honor Robert?" "Nothing big, just a small ceremony with his unit," he asked, his voice gentle but hopeful. Evelyn nodded, her voice soft but certain, a quiet resolve in her tone. "Of course, 10 o'clock would be perfect." Reed smiled, a glint in his eye that Evelyn couldn't decipher, leaving her anticipating what was to come, the promise of something extraordinary hanging in the air like a whisper of hope. The next morning, Evelyn woke early, despite the late night, her body still humming with the emotions of the evening, a quiet energy that coursed through her veins. She made her coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunrise paint the autumn leaves amber, a rare sense of peace settling over her, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in decades, she felt a lightness. Sharing Robert's stories with those who knew him as their sergeant had been healing, a balm to the wounds she'd carried for so long, a bridge to the past that didn't hurt to cross. At 9:30, she dressed in her best emerald dress, reserved for special occasions, the fabric soft against her skin, a vibrant contrast to the muted tones of her daily life. She dabbed on a touch of rose lipstick, a small act of care she hadn't bothered with in years, a quiet nod to the woman she'd once been. At 10 o'clock, she opened her front door and froze, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding with a mix of awe and disbelief. Her entire yard was covered in American flags, hundreds of them in perfect rows, their colors vivid against the morning light, a sea of red, white, and blue that stretched as far as she could see. Standing in formation on her driveway were at least 50 uniformed soldiers, at rigid attention, their faces solemn but their eyes warm with respect, a tribute that took her breath away. Reed stepped forward in dress uniform, his posture formal but his eyes warm, a quiet pride in his stance. "Mrs. Harper, on behalf of those who served with Sergeant Robert Harper, we wanted to do this right," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. A black limousine pulled up, its sleek surface gleaming in the sunlight, and Senator Ellis emerged, her scarf replaced with a formal suit, followed by the Secretary of Defense and, to Evelyn's shock, the Vice President of the United States, their presence a testament to the magnitude of the moment. The neighborhood had gathered, hands over hearts, news vans lining the street, their cameras flashing in the morning sun, capturing a moment that would echo far beyond Willow Creek. "Ladies and gentlemen," the secretary began, his voice carrying over the crowd, a commanding presence that demanded attention. "We are here to honor not one American hero, but two." Cameras flashed as the vice president stepped forward, presenting Evelyn with Robert's Silver Star and Purple Heart, the medals gleaming in the sunlight, a tangible link to the man she'd loved. "Your husband's bravery saved 3 soldiers at the cost of his health," the vice president said, his tone reverent, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet respect. "And from what I've learned, Mrs. Harper, you've carried on his legacy in your own quiet way, touching lives with your kindness, a legacy of love that mirrors his courage." Neighbors who'd barely noticed Evelyn for years chanted her name, "Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn," their voices a chorus of newfound respect, a wave of sound that washed over her, filling the empty spaces in her heart. The mayor of Willow Creek, who'd only ever nodded to her in church, stepped forward, tears in his eyes, his voice trembling with emotion. "From this day forward, October 19th will be Robert and Evelyn Harper Day in Willow Creek, honoring our military heroes and the families who support them, a day to remember the quiet strength that holds us together," he declared, his words a promise etched into the town's history. Conclusion. Evelyn stood in stunned silence, clutching the medals to her chest, the cool metal a tangible link to Robert's sacrifice, a piece of him she could hold once more. Reed raised his hand, and 50 soldiers saluted her in unison, their movements precise and reverent, a tribute that brought fresh tears to her eyes, a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "The president sends his regrets he couldn't be here," the vice president added, his voice warm with sincerity. "But he asked me to give you this letter of thanks for your decades of support to our military, a testament to the impact of your quiet heroism." As reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing like stars in the morning light, Evelyn found her voice, her words clear despite the emotion trembling within her, a quiet strength that echoed Robert's own. "The honor belongs to Robert," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "and to all who serve. I'm just a dry cleaner who believes in saying thank you, in honoring the sacrifices that keep us free." Her humility only endeared her more, and within hours, Evelyn Harper, the invisible widow who pressed uniforms and left notes of gratitude, became a national symbol of quiet heroism, a beacon of hope in a world that often overlooked the small acts that mattered most. 5 years later, Evelyn, now 72, still works at Carter's Dry Cleaning, renamed Harper Service Cleaners in honor of her and Robert's legacy. Despite calls to retire, she continues her routine, but she's no longer invisible, her presence a light in the lives of those who know her. "I don't need to rest," she tells those who ask, her voice firm with purpose, a quiet fire in her eyes. "Every uniform I press has a story, a person behind it, a life I can touch in my own small way. This isn't just a job, it's how I connect with people like Robert, how I keep his memory alive." The shop is now a gathering place for veterans, who come not just for uniforms, but for coffee and conversation with the woman whose story inspired a movement, a place where stories of courage and kindness are shared over steaming mugs. Evelyn teaches her young staff, her voice steady with wisdom. "It's not medals that define us, it's the small daily actions. How carefully you fold a shirt, how sincerely you say thank you. That's what matters, that's what builds a life worth living." The shop walls are lined with photos. Robert in his army uniform, his smile bright and unwavering, a light in the darkness. Evelyn at the White House receiving the Civilian Medal of Honor, her expression a mix of awe and humility, a moment she'd never dreamed of, and dozens of soldiers who visited over the years, their faces a testament to the lives she's touched, a gallery of gratitude that tells a story of connection. Using the stipend from Robert's medals, Evelyn founded the Robert Harper Silent Hero Scholarship for children of veterans and essential workers, a legacy of support for those who give so much. She visits schools and bases, sharing Robert's story and the power of small actions, her voice steady as she speaks to wide-eyed children and stoic soldiers alike, her words a bridge between generations. "My husband never knew the full impact of his sacrifice," she often says, her eyes glistening with memory, a quiet pride in her tone. "And I never knew the impact of my notes." That's the magic of kindness. You rarely see where it leads, but it always finds a way to shine. Her story has rippled far beyond Willow Creek, a wave of inspiration that touches lives she'll never meet. Evelyn's niece, Sarah, joined the Army, inspired by her legacy, a new generation carrying the torch. "You have no idea, Aunt Evelyn," she wrote from overseas, her letter stained with the dust of a distant land. "But my unit knows about Mrs. Harper and her notes. They say as long as America has people like you, we'll always have a reason to serve, a reason to keep going." Schools now teach Evelyn's story in their citizenship programs, showing children that heroism isn't just on battlefields but in the quiet kindness of ordinary lives, a lesson that shapes young hearts. On her 70th birthday, over 1,000 veterans marched past her house in a parade, their footsteps a thunderous tribute to her impact, a symphony of gratitude that echoed through the streets of Willow Creek. A statue of Evelyn and Robert now stands in the town square, inscribed, "The Silent Heroes," a permanent reminder of the power of love and kindness, a beacon for all who pass by. A viewer named Lisa wrote to us, her words a testament to the story's reach. "Evelyn's story inspired me to write a thank you note to my brother, a veteran. That note brought us closer than ever. He said it saved him on a dark day, gave him a reason to keep going." General Reed, now retired, named his son Robert, a living tribute to the man who'd saved him. "He reminds me daily of the power of kindness," he said, his voice warm with memory, a smile playing on his lips. In a rare interview, Evelyn was asked, "Do you think Robert is proud of you?" Tears streamed down her face as she smiled, her voice soft but certain, a quiet joy in her tone. "No, I think he's laughing, saying, 'See, Evelyn, I told you, the small things matter most.' And now I know he was right. Now I see the truth in his words." A seat on a bus, a simple note, a warm embrace, Sometimes that's all it takes to change a life, to set off a chain of events that ripples through time. Evelyn's journey reminds us that no act of kindness is too small to make a difference, a lesson that resonates with the values of courage, resilience, and gratitude that connect us all, a thread that binds us together in the tapestry of humanity. Reflect on Evelyn's story. What small act of kindness can you do today? This week, write a note to someone who matters to you. Tag us with #EvelynChallenge to share the ripple effect, to show the world the power of kindness in action. Let's inspire each other to make a difference, just like Evelyn did, and keep the legacy of compassion alive, a movement that starts with you. 5 years ago, Evelyn Harper gave up her seat on a crowded bus, a small act that set off a chain of events she never could have imagined. The next morning, she opened her door to a sight she'll never forget. Her yard covered in American flags, soldiers saluting her in honor of Robert, a tribute to the love they'd shared. Her story, shared by Daily Narrated Stories, shows that true heroes work in the quiet spaces of everyday life, changing the world one small gesture at a time, a legacy of kindness that endures. If Evelyn's story moved you, don't wait. Subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories now for more tales of real kindness that uplift and inspire, stories that remind us of the power within us all. Time is fleeting, and these stories remind us to act with compassion today, to seize the moment before it slips away. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs a spark of hope, and together, let's keep the legacy of silent heroes alive. Join us at Daily Narrated Stories, where every tale is a chance to change the world, one small act at a time. Don't miss your chance to be part of this movement, to be a hero in your own story.